Good morning. Thank you very much, Gunter. On behalf of the IAAF Coaches Commission, I would like to welcome all the coaches to the fourth and last date of the World Coaches Conference. It so far has been a big success. I report to the council, IAAF council, and I see like President Koch this morning, and I have been mentioning to him how the success of this exercise, this format on getting the coaches together during the World Championships. We started back in Berlin, and we have, this is about the fourth or fifth one that we have, because we have in juniors championships and all the senior championships. But I want to congratulate you for supporting the efforts from the development department, especially Gunter, Stefan, and Vicky, for putting this together. We just came up with the idea, and we do give the support on behalf of the Council and the Coaches Commission. But this is a way to get all the coaches' family together. There's some big plans coming ahead that we will try to make sure that all the areas are in tune with the same projects that we are planning to. We also have ongoing biomechanical research that's been done right here in London, and it's going to be published sometime
after this conference.
After the conference. So once again, welcome. And we're ready for the first presentation this morning. Gunter?
Thank you, Victor. 4 out of 4. We have covered endurance, strength, and speed. And we are really pleased to offer you a topic which, for most of us, is new. I know some came to me and said, what the hell, the brain is a performance limiting factor? I'm pleased that quite a lot of you found this topic interesting. So it is not about measuring our brain today, otherwise I would not have dared to come here this morning. But I think that we have neglected this area. And I'm pleased that with Mr. Neil Dalloway, we managed to get one of the researchers who has been working in that field, how to improve brain performance and directly improve physical performance in the area of endurance. One of the strengths of our conference has been that it was cross-cutting. So we had throwing coaches discussing with distance coaches about nutrition. So that's why we on purpose have invited, after brain endurance, for the plenum part, a coach, a medalist, who is definitely not in endurance, but in the event of pole vault. So I'm pleased that we will have, in the second part, on the podium, Mitchell Creer. Mitchell is here. Where is he? I saw him. Can you stand up so we know that you are in the room? Give him a clap. And Mitchell will give us, from his experience, how he is working with the brain. Just to warm you up on that, his athlete who won the gold medal, Katrina, will also join us. And she is one of the few athletes, and he's one of the few coaches, who have managed to bring a youth world champion until the senior champion. We all know that there are too many dropouts. We definitely have a chance to ask him, what did you do different? And what was the role of brain training in that? I look forward to your contribution. The format opens you the opportunity to ask questions. And I think that this is one of the reasons why so many of you come again and again. So it's not just to have an applied science presentation, which gives us some new idea and sometimes headache, but also you can ask. The quality of this conference is only as good as your questions. So I invite you, again, don't be afraid, ask questions. There are no stupid questions. If you don't ask the question, you stay stupid. But if you ask the question, maybe our people know the answer and you will come home not only better informed, but also motivated. I'm stopping here. I want to open the floor for Neil Dalloway. You see his CV on the screen. Researcher, working not only in track and field, there's this other, I don't call it sport, this entertainment business of football, so he has been in that too. We are suffering from football, I know. He has a solid background in sports and exercise science, and I'm pleased that he is with us today to show us his research about brain performance and endurance performance. Please give a warm welcome to Neil. He asked me for German water, but I was not allowed to give him German water. You know German water? You know what is German water? Not tap water.
Okay. Hello? Is that working?
No, it's working.
Yeah. Right. So thank you for Gunther for the kind introduction and for inviting me here today. As I say, my name is Neil Dalloway, and I'm going to talk about brain as a performance limiting factor in endurance exercise. If this works.
Sure.
Did before.
Just be patient. It's not a brain, it's just a computer.
Right. So Gunther's introduced me, but my first slide just introduced myself a little bit. I am a sports scientist researching the role of the brain in endurance exercise, and prior to this I worked for, across 4 seasons, at a professional football club, monitoring first team training and competitive match load. Prior to this I had a 10-year career, software career in digital broadcast engineering, but my interest in sports science comes from my own hobbies as a recreational endurance athlete, predominantly cycling, where I once cycled from the back to the UK from New Zealand and done multiple Ironman triathlons and marathon runs. So the contents of my talk, first of all, I'll just give a brief overview of some of the current models of brain regulation of endurance performance. I'll then move on to this how mental fatigue, the state of mental fatigue can impair performance, and then this new interventions which we've been investigating called brain endurance training, where building resilience to the negative effects of mental fatigue can potentially, or has been shown to improve physical performance. And then at the end, I'll just summarize how these findings from these studies can be applied in coaching practice. So maybe some ideas of how you could incorporate this with your athletes. So the first model which I'll discuss is the central governor theory, which I assume a lot of you may have heard of. This is proposed by Professor Tim Noakes initially in 1996, and this basically moves away from the traditional sports science view of examining fatigue in the peripheral physiological systems of, say, restricted by cardiac output or lactate or some other factor in the peripheral system, and looked at the role of the brain. And he basically said that the central governor is a subconscious process within the brain which receives afferent feedback from the physiological systems and then restricts motor unit output in order to preserve for heart's blood supply and to protect the body from going into potential fatal homeostasis. So basically the brain acts as a governor limiting the exercise performance of an individual so they can't damage themselves. And this model has been criticised, it's been developed over the last 20 years, and it's been criticised by other physiologists who claim that some of the claims in it aren't quite true. And in 2008, it was criticised by another physiologist who agreed that the brain limited exercise, but Professor Samuel Makora wrote this article or an opinion piece called "Do We Really Need a Central Governor to Explain Brain Regulation of Exercise Performance?" And he proposed his own model called the psychobiological model. And this basically says, but is based upon motivational intensity theory. So it's quite simple. If the reward, either winning a gold medal or escaping from a life-threatening event, like running from a lion or something, is greater than the cost, and the cost being the perceived exertion to the individual, then that individual will persist at the task. And then the cost is centrally generated. So this is one of the main ways in which it differs from the central governor model. He doesn't believe that afferent feedback contributes to the sensation of effort, and I'll come on to that a little bit later. But he also says that this disengaging from a task is a voluntary process, a conscious voluntary process to a high perception of effort. And one of his criticisms of the central governor model was that it can't be tested. He also said it was biologically implausible, internally inconsistent, and overly complicated. So his model is a lot simpler. But he also says it can be tested. And he says any intervention which will change performance without either an effect on motivation or the cost of a perceived exertion will disprove this model. So I mentioned that the two models differ in how they think that perceived exertion is generated. So the psychobiological model doesn't think that afferent feedback contributes to the perception of effort. And Sam Makora wrote a big literature review called "Perfection of Effort During Exercise is Independent of Afferent Feedback from the Skeletal Muscle, Heart and Lungs." And he basically summarised a load of experiments which have shown that by blocking afferent feedback, perception of effort still can exist, essentially. And he thinks that sensation of effort is centrally generated. And this is done by a process called colliery discharge or efferent copy. So it's when you issue a motor command, a copy of that command is copied from the motor cortical areas to the sensory areas of the brain so that you're aware that you've made that action. And as you exercise over time, this efferent copy builds up, builds up, builds up, and this is what contributes to the sensation of fatigue. And one of the main points is you can be tired at rest. Maybe you've gone for a run this morning, you're sat there now, and you're tired. You have fatigue, but your effort level is 0. And then, as mentioned before, the central governor model believes that afferent feedback contributes to the sensation of fatigue and then limits exercise output. This now, with the latest 2012 model from Tim Noakes, with a paper called "Fatigue as a Brain-Deprived Emotion," that regulates exercise performance to ensure the protection of whole body homeostasis. He now says it interacts with efferent copy of motor commands, and now the recent central governor models do make an attempt to separate fatigue and effort. So they'll use traditional Borg scales for rating perceived exertion, and then also this new task effort and awareness scale for the sensation of mental effort, specifically on the task. So I'll just briefly talk about two other hypotheses. So the serotonin hypothesis, which basically, or sometimes called the neurotransmitter hypothesis, which basically says that once serotonin levels increase, they increase during exercise, and as they increase, they're associated with a sensation of fatigue, and as a result, there'll be reduced motor unit recruitment. So there's been some empirical experimental studies done with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which will prolong the the use of serotonin in the brain, and then as the hypothesis is that will then reduce exercise performance, but none has really shown this. And then also nutritional interventions with branched-chain amino acids, because a precursor to tryptophan, for precursor to serotonin is tryptophan, which has to be generated in the brain, and branched-chain amino acids compete for the same transporter across the blood-brain barrier. So the theory is if you supplement with branched-chain amino acids, the ratio of branched-chain amino acids to free tryptophan in the blood plasma changes, less tryptophan gets in the brain, and then you will create less serotonin. And again, this doesn't have an effect on performance. But there's also other neurotransmitters, such as dopamine, which is associated with the willingness to exert effort and motivation and reward, and also noradrenaline, which is associated with attention and arousal. And some interventions which have increased these have been shown to enhance exercise performance in the heat. But one of the problems with the serotonin or the neurotransmitter type hypothesis is, are they a cause or an effect? Are they a cause of the fatigue, or are they just elevated due to the fatigue? But all those models traditionally come from exercise physiologists. This strength control model comes more from a psychological area of research, but there has been quite a lot of experimental evidence in this area, so it's worth a brief mention, where basically they have the analogy of self-control or willpower to a muscle. And as a muscle, if you use it, it gets tired, but also like a muscle, if you train it, it can become stronger. So any activity which requires willpower, such as self-regulation, could have an effect on further activities which also require willpower, such as running a 10,000 metres race. Initially, this area of research has been applied to areas such as binge eating, substance abuse, anything which requires self-control. But now it's moved into the areas of sports exercise science, and there has been a lot of, as I mentioned at the start, experimental research which has shown the role of response inhibition on exercise performance. I'll come on to response inhibition more as we move through the talk. But it's worth bearing in mind, if you want to investigate further, to maybe look into the strength control model. So I've summarised some of the methods of how the brain regulates, or the theories of why the brain regulates exercise performance. But what are the implications of this? Well, any intervention which will act centrally and affect perceived exertion, according to psychobiological model, decrease perceived exertion and you'll increase the performance. So a lot of sort of psychological interventions such as music and placebos have been shown to do this. But additionally, things like caffeine, modafinil, sort of pharmaceutical interventions have also been shown to act centrally and improve performance. And then on the opposite side of this is things which can increase perceived exertion, such as mental fatigue, sleep deprivation, will reduce performance. So obviously all these things cannot act directly on the muscle, they act on the brain, and then how that regulates exercise. So basically, affect RPE and you'll have an effect on performance. So just a summary of the brain regulation of exercise performance. Exercise starts and ends in the brain. It's very obvious the state. You recruit motor units, you move, then you stop recruiting motor units. And motor command comes from the brain. Maybe this has been forgotten over the years with exercise physiologists looking at peripheral things in isolation, but it's coming more into looking at the role of the brain in the last sort of decades or so. But it's important to take an integrated approach. Traditionally, fatigue has been separated into peripheral fatigue and central fatigue, and now even mental fatigue. But it's probably best to have an integrated approach. And there's a new model, which I haven't gone into, but it's called the integrative governor. And some of the initial collaborators with Tim Noakes on the central governor model have just released this paper of their new updated sort of integrated approach called the integrative model. As on the last slide, perceived exertion, or the rate of perceived exertion, is very important. If you can manipulate this, you can change performance. And as a way of investigating the role of the brain, experimental studies which have looked at pharmaceutical interventions such as Ritalin, which is an ADHD drug, has been shown to improve force output, and modafinil, which is a narcoleptic drug, has been shown to improve endurance performance. These are interesting to look at because from the drug studies, people know what areas of the brain they activate or which they shut off, and it's a way of investigating which areas of brain or brain connectivity affects performance. But you often hear these terms when describing athletic performance. If you saw the BBC commentary of Mo Farah in the 10,000 metres on Friday night, I'm pretty sure they use every word on this list, like his willpower, his grit, his determination. So now the question's being asked in this area of research, are there structural connective differences in the brain of an elite athlete which enables them to have these personality traits to a person who's not an elite athlete? So this brings me on to the role of mental fatigue on the brain. And mental fatigue has been is characterised as a psychobiological state caused by prolonged periods of demanding cognitive activity, which is characterised by subjective feelings of tiredness and a lack of energy. And mental fatigue has been shown to impair endurance performance. So in 2009, Samuel Makora did this study where he had a group of people and they completed either 90 minutes of this cognitive task, which is the AX continuous performance task. And this stresses working memory, response inhibition and error monitoring to induce a state of mental fatigue. They either did that or they watched an emotionally neutral documentary and then for the same amount of time. And then when they came back to the lab, they did the opposite condition. I'll talk more about the types of cognitive tasks towards the end of the presentation, but they are quite important. They have to stress certain brain areas or processes. They then cycled to exhaustion on a fixed cycle ergometer. And when they was in the mental fatigue condition, by completing the 90 minutes of the cognitive task, they rated their mental effort higher on the task, loads of things, frustration, things like this. But then when they completed the exercise bout, there was a 15% reduction. So in the control condition, watching the documentary, they did 754 seconds. When mentally fatigued, they could only manage 640 seconds. And there's no physiological differences between the two groups. So those completing the exercise at the same heart rate, the same lactate levels, whatever the measures were in the paper, they were identical between the two in the two conditions. Both groups quit at the same level of perceived exertion, because obviously you disengage from activity once it becomes, you think it's too much, you reach your maximum effort and then you stop. But interestingly, when mentally fatigued, they started the exercise bouts at a higher level of perceived exertion. So then obviously the rate of perceived exertion increases the same across the two conditions, but because they're starting at a higher rate, they reach their maximum level of effort earlier. So and why is this? The paper speculated that it's the area of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex. And this is associated with physiological responses such as heart rate, breathing, and general automatic responses to exercise. But it's also been shown to become more active when performing mentally demanding tasks, specifically those which involve sustained attention, conflict resolution, and response inhibition. So basically, the area of the brain becomes tired during doing this task, and then as a result, because this area of the brain is also associated or used during physiological responses to exercise, it impairs performance. So basically, if you get your brain tired, it's going to affect your physical performance in a basic nutshell way of looking at it. So since this study, there's been quite a lot of other studies which has looked at mental fatigue. So I'll just summarise an overview of how mental fatigue affects performance here. And it's now well established that it does impair submaximal endurance exercise. And there's a systematic review on all these experiments here, the reference at the bottom. Not much research has been done on anaerobic exercise, but the ones which have not shown any negative effects of mental fatigue. And this is believed because with anaerobic exercise, you are restricted physiologically. You just go flat out. The role of the brain is a lot less. But as we saw yesterday, even in the sprint exercises, tasks, there is still a high component of aerobic contribution. Some research has been done in sport-specific skills. So mental fatigue has been shown to impair soccer-specific skills and also cricket-specific skills. So for field athletes, this could have mental fatigue could potentially have a negative effect for them, because obviously there's a high skill component in the motor control of the field-based athletics. But then most of the research has been done on amateur athletes. Very little has been done on elite athletes. But there is one study done in Australia on elite professional cyclists, and they did 30 minutes of a cognitive task, and they were found to have superior performance on the cognitive task. But when it came to the physical exercise, they did not have the negative effects of mental fatigue. So they performed better on the cognitive task, and then it didn't impair their performance during the physical activity. So maybe elite athletes, either through genetics or through the physical training, have strengthened or improved the connectivity in their brains, which are involved in both cognitive and mental tasks. But I would say that more research is needed with elite athletes, because even though these professional cyclists were meant to be, are like high-end, I spoke to the authors, they are high-end, they only average 320 watts for the 20-minute time trial, which does not, to me, I would expect it to be a lot higher for elite athletes, a lot higher. So maybe they were, even though they said they were going flat out, maybe they were performing more submaximally, where you may not see the negative effects of mental fatigue going at submaximal aerobic pace. So this moves us on to the concept of brain endurance training. This is basically, we've seen that mental fatigue can impair performance, so can building resilience to mental fatigue improve performance? This was proposed by Sam Makora, where the systematic repetition of mentally fatiguing cognitive tasks will increase the load on the brain, specifically in the cortical areas which are relevant to exercise and also the cognitive task. This will induce adaptations in these areas, and as a result could reduce the perception of effort. And as we've seen, if you reduce your perception of effort, it can have a positive impact on performance. This is not to be confused with traditional sort of brain training or cognitive functioning of just thinking or whatever, but the tasks have to be stress-specific brain regions. As I say, I'll come on to the cognitive tasks further at the end. But just bear in mind that you couldn't just say, get something like this and then apply it. You'd have to choose your cognitive tasks specifically. So I'll first of all summarise his study. As I understand it, this was sponsored by the Ministry of Defence in the UK because they wanted to see if their troops could make better cognitive decisions when mentally tired. So they sponsored this research, I think, for that reason, but one of the findings from it was that it actually improved performance, physical performance. So there was 40 soldiers. They were put into two groups, a brain endurance group. There was a few dropouts, so 17 went into the brain endurance group and 18 into the control group. Late 20s, average height, average weight. They then completed 12 weeks of physical training, 3 times a week at 65% of their VO2 max for an hour. So in total, 36 training sessions. So quite submaximal exercise, just a steady, sort of typical bland endurance training program. While cycling, the brain endurance training group performed the mentally fatiguing task on a computer. So for 60 minutes, they did the VAX continuous performance task, which has previously been shown to induce a state of mental fatigue. And the control group was not involved in any mentally fatiguing tasks whatsoever. And importantly, both groups did exactly the same amount of physical work. So there's a timeline of the study protocol here. So VO2 max test at the start, time to exhaustion, also this foot patrol for 3 hours, but results of that aren't available. 6 weeks of training, 3 times a week, halfway testing, another 6 weeks of training, and then the final testing, which is the same as the start testing, apart from also a sleep deprivation study, which is not in the results. So this graph just shows on the left the physiological responses to the training. So shows clearly here this is heart rate, so from 110 beats per minute at the start, and then over the hour goes up to about 135 beats per minute. So a very submaximal endurance training program. But what's important is there's no difference between the groups. So it looks that, at least from heart rate responses, both groups responded physically the same to the training. But on the self-report measures, the blue bar is the the brain endurance training group, and they reported a higher mental demand on the tasks relative to the control group. They also reported higher temporal demand, performance and effort, whereas they did not rate the physical demand any different. So on to the results. I said they did VO2 max pre 6 weeks and post, and at the start both groups were about 40 millilitres per kilogram per minute of VO2, halfway just under 50 and then up to 52. So as you'd expect, they did 12 weeks of training, they improved their VO2 max from 40 up to 52. And importantly, there's no difference in between the groups. So you'd expect this, they did exactly the same physical training, their VO2's maxes responded the same. But where it gets interesting is when you look at the time to exhaustion test results. At the start, the brain endurance group could do I think this was 75% VO2 max. So the test is very similar to the training, except it's a slightly higher intensity. At the start of the training, the brain endurance training group could do 30 minutes, halfway just over 40 minutes, and at the end, an hour. Whereas the control group at the start could do 20 minutes, maybe 27 at the start, at the midpoint, and then 30 minutes at the end. So both groups improved, but there is a much larger improvement in the brain endurance training group. There is quite a problem here with the differences at baseline. You'd expect them to maybe be the same, and maybe as they were randomized to a group, maybe they could have stratified on start time, so this difference was not there. But the authors state when they adjust for baseline differences, the improvements in the brain group is even more pronounced. So this shows that maybe they've been doing, the brain group has been doing the exercise with the cognitive task. You take the cognitive task away, suddenly exercise feels easier, and then the test is similar to the training. They're not having to do the cognitive task. Potentially they may have induced adaptations in their brain which are used for both cognitive tasks and the physical task, and they're able to go further. That's the hypothesis. And then this is basically showing the same but in kilojoules, so it's easier to see that the brain group have done twice as much work after the training intervention than the control group, so from 1200 to 600. So this brings us on to what we did at the University of Birmingham. And this is just a quick overview. Mental fatigue impairs performance, potentially building resilience to mental fatigue by this concept of brain endurance training can improve physical performance. But only one study has shown this, the one I just described. And the underlying mechanisms, even though speculated, have yet to be determined. So we had two aims: to replicate this brain endurance effect and also to investigate potential mechanisms. So our protocol, very similar. We had pre-intervention testing, participants split into 2 groups, control and brain endurance training, where exercise and cognitive task. Our physical activity was dynamic rhythmic hand grip exercise, where the participants would hear a ping on a metronome once a second, and for 5 minutes they would have to squeeze the metronome, squeeze the hand grip as hard as they could and generate as much force in that time period. We chose this physical task because it was novel to all participants. It enabled us to take more measures in a little bit more practical manner. And then obviously the brain group also did a cognitive task. They did this for 6 weeks. We chose 6 weeks at 4 times a week because that's 2/3 of the training sessions as a Macora experiment, and also there was a benefit at 6 weeks. But from previous hand grip studies, which have investigated other reasons such as cross-learning of how one limb can develop when you train the other, or blood pressure, 6 weeks has been shown to have quite big changes because it's something that you don't normally train. And then we had post-intervention testing afterwards. So our participants were healthy young sports exercise students, undergraduate students, and then they completed this task once a second for 5 minutes, and they did this under 3 counterbalance conditions in the pre and the post-testing. So a subsequent condition, a concurrent condition, and a solo condition. And this was the subsequent task where we try to induce a mild state of mental fatigue by having them do 10 minutes of a cognitive task, followed by the 5 minutes of the physical task. The solo task, which is the physical task on its own, and then just been told to lower my mic, sorry. And then the concurrent task, where the non-dominant hand uses the mouse to respond to the cognitive task, and the dominant hand squeezes.
Sorry, sir, it's not lowering your mic. Speaking a little slower so we can pass your message properly.
Okay.
Would be very good.
Okay. Right. Okay. So the concurrent task. The concurrent task was done with the non-dominant hand responding with the mouse to the cognitive tasks, and with the right hand done with the physical activity. And the reason we did this was because the previous experiment had shown a direct improvement on performance, but what happens if there wasn't? We'd at least expect the brain endurance group to be better at doing the concurrent tasks, or maybe they could resist the negative effects of mental fatigue. So we just had 3 conditions which would give us more insight into the role of brain endurance training. And this was done in randomized permutation, so it was counterbalanced across the groups, because obviously there would be a learning effect, or one activity could impact on the other activity. So the measures we took, the physiological measures, we had 3 lead ECG to measure heart rate and heart rate variability. We also took electromyographic forearm activity of the flexicarpi radialis and the flexicarpi unilaris. These are the muscles involved in grip strength. And we did this because there has been some studies which has shown an elevated central command or motor command as measured by EMG when a participant is mentally fatigued. And then we also looked at the prefrontal cortex with near-infrared spectroscopy. And this, just as a very basic overview, basically an infrared light is shined into the brain region of interest, is then reflected back, and there's a receiver on the other side, and the wavelength of the reflected, or the density, the light is reflected back differently dependent on whether the hemoglobin has oxygen bound to it or not. So it gives an idea of the blood flow to the prefrontal cortex and also the extraction of the oxygen. And then also force output for performance. So it was basically heart, muscle and brain which we were interested in. And then the psychological measures before and after each of the 3 tasks, we took they filled out a questionnaire for motivation, perceived exertion, physical and mental exertion, and also physical exertion, mental exertion and mental fatigue, and also their mood states. So onto the training. As I said, control or BET, so control physical only, the BET group physical plus the cognitive tasks. Submaximal, the training was submaximal, so we would guide at the start the participants how much to squeeze. Typically it was designed at 30% of their MVC, and this would take 15 minutes. So on the other slide it said 30 minutes, that's because by the time they arrived at the lab, filled out the questionnaires, did the physical exercise, which ended up lasting 15 minutes, and the post exercise questionnaires, it would be typically 30 minutes, but 15 minutes of exercise. The BET group also completed concurrent cognitive tasks with their non-dominant hand during the submaximal squeezing. These tasks were designed to impose demands on attention, memory and response inhibition processes. But the most important thing, same as the previous study, physical workload was matched identically between the two groups. And as any training program, you expect progressive overload. So each week, the force requirement which each participant had to generate relative to their MVC increased, and also the cognitive tasks became progressively more difficult. So our results. Basically, we have 3 tasks here, and then pre and post on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have the average force as a percentage of the MVC per second. So across all 3 tasks, all participants improved as a result of training. In the control group, some of these look quite flat. That's because it's relative to their MVC. If you look in newtons, just raw force, these graphs are a lot more steeper. But this also shows us that, as well as the performance improvements, it also shows us that the brain endurance group were able to get more out of themselves as a percentage of their maximum. So it's sort of like, why can some athletes run at a higher percentage of their VO2 max than others? So in the subsequent task, following the cognitive task, but same at the start, but then a clear increase on the solo task. And then this one is quite lower on the concurrent task, and this is because if you're doing the mental task at the same time, some of your attention is taken away from squeezing. So even though the participants were instructed to generate as much force as they couldn't do it as much as when they weren't also concentrating on the cognitive task. So you have to bear this in mind when I talk about the applications of brain endurance training, that it may actually impair physical performance during the training. So if you wanted to do high quality sessions, it will have an impact on that. And then of the physiological measures which we took, this is probably the most interesting. So this is the results from the near-infrared spectroscopy and the prefrontal cortex activation. And prefrontal cortex is an area of the brain which is associated with executive functioning, goal setting, emotional regulation. And on the y-axis we have tissue oxidation index, which as a percentage indicates the extraction of the oxygen by the prefrontal cortex. And then on the x-axis we have the time. This is the average across the 5 minutes of the 3 tasks. So you can see it stays pretty much at 0% in the pre-testing, but then in the post-testing, where all participants are generating more force and the brain group are generating even more force, the brain group can do this without an increased demand on their prefrontal cortex. So the control group are having to use their executive functioning or their prefrontal cortex more in order to focus on the task. The BET group haven't had to do this. And then the EMG, again, averaged over the 5 minutes for the 3 tasks as a percentage of their maximum. No changes pre and post. This is interesting to look at because it shows the pacing strategy involved by the participants, and they're the same shape curve pre and post. So brain training didn't affect their pacing strategy. Also similar if you look at the force in this manner. Cardiac activity, this is heart rate variability, so the standard deviation of the interval between heartbeats. And just as a general overview, if you have a low heart rate, generally you're considered to be relaxed, less effort. But if you have a low heart rate variability, it means that your heartbeats are very regular, and it indicates, can indicate stress. So in the pre-testing, there's no difference between the groups, very flat. But then in the post-testing, over time, the heart rate variability in the Beck group increases. So this indicates that potentially they are requiring less effort to do the task. So they're performing at a higher physical rate and potentially at a less effort for them. And then with the psychological measures, one of the interesting findings, which wasn't expecting, we took a measure of interest and enjoyment of the tasks. So I could understand maybe during the training, the brain group might not have enjoyed it as much because they're doing the two tasks at the same time, where the control group are just doing the physical task. But this is in the post-testing, where it's the same for everyone. And at the start, because it's a novel task, they're both the same at about 3.5 out of 5, so quite high enjoyment. Over the 6 weeks, it declines for both groups, but it declines more in the brain endurance group. So possibly they've lost their enjoyment of the tasks. So this improved performance has come at a cost of their interest and enjoyment of the activities. Important though, all other self-reported measures were the same. So we asked them to go maximally during the task, so it's important that they both had the same RPE. Their motivation was the same, which is important because if the motivation was higher in one group than the other, that could be used to explain the performance differences. So important that there were no sort of manipulation checks on the experiment. So important that they came out the same. So the discussion of our findings. 6 weeks of brain endurance training, as a Macora study, has shown to improve performance. We only had 23% average as a percentage of MVC per second compared to physical training alone, which was 5%. These numbers can be high if you look in terms of raw force, but relative to their maximum, they're high. But that's still quite a large improvement, and an improvement in the Beck group over the physical-only group. This was achieved for same physiological measures. Apart from in the Beck group, the improved performance, the higher improved performance occurred without the additional demands on the prefrontal cortex, which was shown in the control group. And also, the increase in heart rate variability over time indicates a reduction in sympathetic nervous system activity, which implies less effort, but at a cost of interest and enjoyment to the participant. So maybe if you engage in brain training, even more challenging and stimulating tasks are required in order to keep it interesting for the person doing it. So I'll just talk briefly how this can be applied to coaching practice. Because you may be thinking, well, that's in a lab, that's fine, you're sat in front of a computer, that's not real world, what do I do when out on the track with my athletes? There's 3 general thoughts on how brain endurance training can be incorporated. One is a separate method where the athlete would do the cognitive demanding tasks separate to their physical training. So just at home in their own, they may do an hour, X amount of times per week of the cognitive tasks. There's been a preliminary study done with a Macora group, and they've shown a time to exhaustion improvement on that, but no full study yet. The concurrent method, which has been these 2 randomized control trials, which I've just described, and there's been a clear performance improvement. So this is when you do the activity at the same time, and then a pre-fatigue method where you induce a state of mental fatigue, and then you do your exercise training. So in a practical sense, the pre-fatigue method could be done at the track, where the athlete will have an iPad and then do the cognitive task on an app and then for a period of time, maybe 60, 90 minutes, and then complete their training session, or potentially in between repetitions. I have heard of a coach in America doing this on a sports science podcast, where they said they'd heard about the Macora study and they had their athletes do 400-metre reps, and then in the interval period, after a short cool down, they would do the Stroop task, which I'll come on to, and then they'd repeat the task. So in their physical rest period, you're putting additional mental load on the athlete. And then concurrent method could be done by smartphone apps with auditory cognitive tasks, and then a 2-button response which will go into the phone and indicate correct or right answers. And then obviously, as we saw in my findings, when you do a concurrent task, performance is impaired. So it would have to be, you'd have to bear that in mind. You couldn't do it during high-quality sessions. And then I mentioned the types of cognitive tasks. We generally use the NBAC, which can be easily progressed in terms of difficulty. It's basically a working memory and sustained attention task where you see letters on the screen one at a time, and you have to reply with a correct or incorrect answer if the current letter shown is the same as 2 prior. So either 2 prior or 3 prior or 4 prior. And you can also increase the difficulty by increasing the refresh rate of the letters. And then when I talked about the strength control model at the start, I talked about this concept of response inhibition. This is when you reply to an activity or in a non-natural way. So in exercise, high intensity, your natural response is probably to slow down for most people because it's too uncomfortable, or to stop, where you have to learn, top athletes can learn to override that natural response and can push through. So the cognitive tasks have to have response inhibition. So the famous one is the Stroop task, where you're shown a word and your natural response to seeing a written word is to read it, but instead of reading it, you have to name the colour it's written in. So in this instance, it would be red. So the correct answer is on the right, but you may have read green. So it just makes you think a little bit. And then maybe the areas of the brain which are involved in response inhibition, there can be neural adaptability or connectivity in those areas, which then may have an increased benefit when doing physical exercise. And there's various different types of Stroop tasks which you can make progressively more difficult as well. So just an overall summary. Mental fatigue impairs performance, so it's probably a good idea to also monitor the mental fatigue of your athletes. So this could be done in simple subjective ratings, same as you would take perceived exertion. You could potentially test athletes, give them a tablet, and then they perform a mental task for 1 or 2 minutes, and that will give you response time and number of correct responses, and then over time you'll build a baseline of how that athlete responds. And if they're slightly down on their normal baseline, maybe they have a mild state of mental fatigue, and maybe their readiness to train that day is not as much as what it should be. But you have to be careful, because if they did these tests for too long, you'll be inducing a state of mental fatigue on the athlete. And obviously, reduce mental fatigue and stress close to competition, and also activities which require response inhibition. They may be talking to journalists directly before a competition. They may be asked awkward questions, and they don't really want to be there, and they're having to be polite, which might not be their natural response. So they might be having to exert self-control over themselves, which could potentially impair performance later on. And then brain endurance training, this new concept, has been shown to improve performance. Maybe you can incorporate it into your training with the suggestions I made. And the types, but if you do, bear in mind that the types of cognitive tasks are very important. And then also, as any training program, you have to manage the load on your athlete. And maybe elite athletes have too much mental load anyway. But it could be used with injured athletes in the off-season, or something different for them to do. If you have an injured athlete and they can't physically train, you could suggest this to them, and then even if they don't think it works, at least they think they're doing something which other athletes aren't doing and could potentially get a benefit from them. So future directions, as all sports scientists say, more research is needed, but in this case it's true because there's only been these 2 studies on brain endurance training done. But it's an exciting new area of research, and we're currently seeking collaborators at the University of Birmingham, and I would just like to thank my colleagues, Professor Chris Ring and Dr. Sam Lucas at the University of Birmingham, and also Professor Samuel Makora for discussions on this topic and also showing the slides on his experiment. And thank you for listening, and any questions?
Thanks a lot, Neil, for this presentation. I'm not sure if this qualifies already as a unit of brain endurance training, but now it's your turn to pay back. Please, questions.
Yeah.
Let's take a seat with this mic, and I use this one for questions.
I'm Peter, distance coach in Holland. I started to use this with a Stroop test, also during workouts. But for me, the difficult part was to find a resource where I could find a solid test to use. Do you have the resource available for coaches here?
We generate our own tests at the university.
Is it available online? Or?
Not our ones, but there are some psychological software companies which do have online things, but normally you have to pay, but they'll have a trial. I can't remember. I looked at them when picking the cognitive task and trialing cognitive tasks. So and sometimes you can get a 30-day free trial. But if you give me your details, I could send you some websites, but I don't know the names of them off the top of my head. Yeah. But yeah, typically you'd have to pay or have someone design a task for you. Maybe if you looked on the app, because this is getting more common now, maybe if you looked on the app stores, maybe there'll be something there as well. But yeah, if you give me your details, I'll forward some information.
Yeah, and also to the other coach, I just made a piece of paper with a Stroop test on it, and it told them like there's like in between, like go from top to down or from left to right, just to switch it up all the time.
That's fine. Yeah. And also sometimes with the computer-based Stroop task, they respond to it with a mouse button or a click. But your natural response is to say the word. So if you get the athletes, if you do use paper-based tests, obviously you can't get reaction.
You don't always have a laptop available readily. So
yeah. But if you use the paper-based ones and they have to speak it, the act of speaking the correct answer is another, it's more real world to response inhibition because there's no spoken part on the computer-based ones. But with the computer-based ones, you get reaction time scores if you're interested in that. So. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Lauren Siegel from the Bahamas. I also work as a sports psychologist, but I mostly work with high school and college students. And so I kind of have a two-part question. So one, in terms of what the effect of cognitive tiring might be on schoolwork and school performance, as well as so you said that things such as an interview, being mentally fatigued can affect performance. How might you balance exams, stressful school times, as well as performance and training?
Yeah, good question. I think at my final slide, I said monitor the overall load on the athletes, and from subjective ratings. You'd have to, since mental fatigue can impair performance, maybe you'd have to ask them what their workload is, and have an idea of what they're doing in other areas of their lives, which may, obviously give more mental demand on them or stress on them, which could affect their performance. So you'd probably just have to ask the athlete, if they have periods of exams, maybe they would be better. You might not want to give them this. It's quite a transient. The mental fatigue can be, unless it's really prolonged and induced and you need to sleep at the end of the day. If you're just doing it for short periods of time, it can be just a transient state of mental fatigue for that brief. And then actually the physical activity can, in our studies, when we give like different bouts of cognitive task and then physical exercise, they actually rate their mental fatigue lower after doing the physical activity. So that physical activity can sort of regenerate their mood states to a certain extent. But obviously if it's really high intensity training and really high cognitive load with additional cognitive tasks and they got exams, it may be too much. So just approach it in a holistic way and try and bear in mind what they're doing outside of the track or these additional techniques if you are using them.
Hi, Professor. I'm Sky from Singapore. I'd like to check with you. Do you think a higher threshold of pain has impact on performance?
I'm not sure on pain. Professor Chris Ring, who I work with, he's done a lot of research on pain. But I do think that some people can tolerate a higher perception of effort, which is probably a little bit different from pain. Maybe they're related, pain thresholds and perceived exertion thresholds, maybe they're related, I don't know. But I do think that there's individual differences on how people perceive both pain and perceived exertion. And then some people, maybe it's from the physical training, they do a lot of hard training and then they just get used to those physical sensations and the sensation of effort and they're able to tolerate it more. Maybe from their background growing up, for some reason they've had adaptations in the brain which enables them to tolerate higher perception of effort. Who knows? But yeah, I do think people are more sensitive to perception of effort, and that's what would make a good athlete. They're able to push through.
Is there any research on threshold of pain with sports itself that you can recommend?
With pain, I don't know. There's lots of the research on perception of effort. Again, my colleague, Professor Ring, has done a lot of research on pain. So if you give me your email address, I could point you in the right direction of that. But that's not my area, pain tolerance. So
thank you very much.
Okay.
Si se puede poner los auriculares, porque hablar en castellano, por favor. ¿Ok? ¿Sí? ¿Ya? ¿Sí? ¿Ok? Soy Juan Ramón Moya, entrenador de la Federación Andorrana de Atletismo, un micropaís situado en el Pirineo entre Francia y España, cerca de Font-Romeu, para situarse donde estoy. En primer lugar, quiero agradecer a la IAAF la invitación que nos ha hecho para poder participar aquí. No tenemos atletas en la actualidad con mínima internacional. En ediciones anteriores teníamos un atleta en maratón, pero ahora no es el caso. Y eso ha llevado que yo también esté aquí presente y poder asistir a estas conferencias. Me ha gustado mucho las explicaciones que han dado durante estos 4 días. Intentaré transmitir a mis compañeros de la federación, pero para nosotros un país de 65.000 habitantes que no llenamos ni el estadio, pues nos es difícil. En edad educativa o en edad de alto rendimiento, pues cualquier club o cualquier universidad de otro país del mundo es más grande que nosotros, pero intentaremos llegarlo a cabo. Y también el presidente COE, tuve un gran placer de escucharle, fue un honor para mí decir que él ha elegido su entrenador, en este caso es como mi hijo Paul, es corredor de 800 y también ha elegido a su padre como entrenador. Quisiera hacerte 2 preguntas. La primera, cuando planificas un entrenamiento de series largas y ves que el atleta no termina de hacer el entrenamiento, ¿qué es mejor? ¿Acabarlo aunque sepas que no va a rendir o, por consiguiente, dejar el entrenamiento ya a medias con supuesto frustración para él? Y después, si en la sociedad de ahora, que está siempre con el móvil y adaptada, conectada completamente cada día, también crea un estrés una fatiga mental a la hora de competir en el rendimiento. Gracias.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for the question. So the question was in two parts. The first part was if an athlete is not going to complete the session, should you push through and finish it? And the second part was obviously things like mobile phones, athletes use them a lot now, could that contribute to mental fatigue? So to answer the first part, well, I'm not a coach myself, I'm a sports scientist, but I engage in a lot of activities. So I would just say you'd have to set the goal of a session before, and then you just have to make a judgment whether pushing through to achieve that goal or getting close to it is the potential cost of pushing through, say getting injured or demotivation, is that worth it? So it's a very general question, it's a very general answer, and I think you'd have to. There may be some occasions, especially depending on the individual, where if you teach them to push through, then that can have a positive benefit in future competition, but there's also a potential downside. So no clear answer, I'm afraid. And then on the second part, obviously, there's a lot of research done on mobile phones and blue light, which has been shown to the blue light from the screen has been shown to disrupt sleep. So just for that reason, I would limit the mobile phone use. And then obviously, what are they doing on the mobile phone? That could be causing them additional stress if they're playing games. That could be inducing cognitive fatigue, potentially. So I would generally limit them, but I don't think there's been any real-world sort of evidence of typical mobile phones apps and then how that would impact on performance. But it clearly could, I think. So I would, yeah, to answer your question, I would generally restrict them, but just for a whole load of reasons, not necessarily related to mental fatigue. Okay.
Oops. Oh, sorry, there's someone was speaking over there.
Okay, no problem. Okay. My name is Olatunde Makanju from Nigeria. Thanks a million for a very stimulating presentation. But as we were going along, my question is from a psychometric point of view. What will be the place of chess playing in brain endurance and mental fatigue? Or have you ever considered using participants who will be playing chess as?
Well, I play chess myself, and obviously sometimes in breaks during work I have a game of chess online, which I don't actually think will probably be beneficial for a rest period from work. But as I said, with the types of cognitive task, I'm not quite sure what brain areas or processes the stress will be, chess will be stressing, and then also it depends on the opponent, because it may be very easy for you to beat them and you don't have to think. But obviously there's a highly strategic component to chess, and it requires memory and visualization of the future and things. So yeah, you could be inducing a state of mental fatigue by that. Whether it could be used as brain endurance training, I'm not so sure, because brain endurance training, it's meant to be like endurance exercise where it's repetitive, it requires sustained attention, and it's prolonged, where chess is probably a little bit different to that. But yeah, it could potentially be used, could potentially induce a state of mental fatigue, and I'm not sure if it could be used in brain endurance training. But again, if you had athletes who were playing chess right up prior to training, maybe that's not the best, because this state of mental fatigue, whether they're mentally alert, mentally ready to then perform high intensity sessions, it could impact on that. So.
Allô. Voilà. Bonjour monsieur, moi je parle français.
Je m'appelle Mamassou Gombala, je suis physiothérapeute aspect ici Dakar. Donc, ok. Oui. Dans votre intervention, vous avez parlé de la sérotonine. Donc, il y a des gens qui disent que, bon, quand vous voulez dormir, si vous prenez une tasse de lait, ça assimile la sérotonine et ça permet de bien dormir. Donc, je voulais savoir, bon, un athlète qui fait les exercices pour la fatigue cognitive et qui n'a pas un bon sommeil, est-ce que les exercices vont être efficaces pour lui permettre de bien récupérer? Merci.
So the question was related to serotonin and its effect on sleep and certain nutritional interventions which can change serotonin levels and could that counteract the effects of mental fatigue? Yeah, possibly. I mean, as I said when I was going through the serotonin slides, branched-chain amino acids can influence the amount of serotonin. So you could supplement with tryptophan, maybe. The whole area of sleep research, again, isn't my field. But there could be nutritional interventions which could help sleep. And sleep is the best way to overcome a state of mental fatigue and also physical fatigue. So I think you should always ensure your athletes are getting optimal sleep for that individual. And anything which you could do to enhance that will definitely have an effect. But I couldn't give specific answers because that's not my general area in sleep. But yeah, I would definitely try and optimize sleep for physical and mental benefits to the athlete. Okay.
Hi, Neil. Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Borja. I'm a PhD student from University of Kent, supervised by Samuele Marcora. And I think it's very important for all of us, for you as a scientist and for coaches, to establish a link and to work in between each other. My question is more related with coaching. As we also make blocks in terms of training, do you think it's going to be useful in the future to establish the same block, let's call it periodization of mental, brain endurance training?
Yeah, I think this area of brain endurance training is so new, and then the optimal effective dose of it and the types of cognitive tasks and the intensity of it and how it affects the performance, that a lot of that still needs to be established. Obviously, it impairs performance, and the Marcora study and my study has shown by doing concurrent tasks can improve performance, but a lot more has to be done. And then once that has been established, then yeah, it could be periodization. As I mentioned on the application slide, maybe in the off-season, especially incorporating it in around high-quality sessions, you might want to remove it then and then incorporate it more in lower-intensity sessions. So there's definitely more research needed in how it could be incorporated, yeah, so I agree with that, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the other question is that could you suggest to the coaches any sort of questionnaire as profile of mood states in order to quantify mental fatigue?
A lot of the research just use a visual analog scale. So a 10 centimeter line with a, they put a mark from highly mentally fatigued to no. That's a very simple way. Obviously there's and quick. So that could be done on an app, and then you get a baseline over time. That would be one suggestion. There's also a lot from, I know Marcora uses the NASA TLX scale, and then there's a profile of mood states from fatigue and vigor, but whether that separates mental and physical fatigue is not so clear. We also use a modified Borg scale for mental exertion and the CR10 scale for mental exertion and mental fatigue. So lots you could use, but my basic suggestion would just be use a simple visual analog scale.